Hello everyone, welcome to HIM 216. This is the first lecture for Chapter 7, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on Chapter 7 because most of these are sections that I don't think you will ever be coding from. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to be covering Chapter 7 briefly and then spending a lot of time on Chapter 8, which is the medical surgical section, and that's the section you'll be coding from the most. As a reminder, when you log into 3M, you are going to go up into this upper right-hand corner and you're going to click on the 10, the red book with the 10 on it. That takes you into ICD-10. Once we're in ICD-10, since we're coding procedures, we're going to click on the Procedures tab. And I will tell you that there were not any, I don't believe, guideline changes for the procedural coding system for 2017. And we'll just pop through here real quick just to confirm that. But as I recall, when I have gone through this, there actually were not any changes in the guidelines that will impact us as we go through root operations in the textbook. So going back to the Procedure tab, I'm going to backtrack for just a minute because there's something I want to make you aware of. In your textbook, I want you to turn to page 95. And I want you to look at this at figure 6.2. This is actually what the paper book looks like. And it's important for you to understand how this is structured. And I'm going to demonstrate this in 3M. But you'll notice that we're in the medical surgical section. And we're in the gastrointestinal system. And we're looking at the root operation of resection. When this pops up, you can see that all of the body parts, the approaches, the devices, the qualifiers, they're all available for you to choose. I'm going to choose R, anal sphincter, and watch what happens. If I choose anal sphincter, the only approaches I have available to me are open or percutaneous endoscopic. The others are grayed out. This corresponds to what you are seeing on page 95. You'll see there is a line between Q, anus, and R, anal sphincter. You can't go back and forth between these. So for instance, for anal sphincter, I can only choose the approach of open or percutaneous endoscopic. Also for greater and lesser omentum. I cannot choose an approach of via natural or artificial opening or endoscopic. They're just not available for those body parts. So when you're using the book, you have to be very careful that you actually stay within these lined areas and not vary out of them, because you're going to come up with the wrong code if you do. In your book, look on page 101. And again, we're in medical surgical. This time we're in the respiratory system, and we're looking at the root operation of destruction. Now you can see everything here is available. But if I choose pleura right, all of a sudden my approaches for via natural or artificial opening are gone. And that's what corresponds to this line that's between lungs bilateral and pleura right. Those root operations, those approaches are no longer available when I choose those body parts. So be very careful with that. This is actually demonstrated very well on, well, let me see. I don't know that that's actually the table. If you look on page 109 and we go to medical surgical, and then we choose the urinary system, and then excision for our root operation. You can see I have access to all of them, but if I choose urethra, Nothing changes. I mean, I still have access to all of the approaches, the devices, and the qualifiers. 034. In the textbook, external is not available for the top one. So let's choose bladder neck. Yep, external's gone. If I choose bladder, external's gone. If I choose either of the ureters. So this is an example of urethra can have any approach, but kidney right, 0 through C, can only have the first, they can't have external as an approach. So I want to make sure that you're aware that that is the difference in the book. That's how the website, how the software actually accommodates for the lines in the book. So as we're going to Chapter 7, there are some abbreviations and acronyms that you need to be familiar with. There are a number of glossary definitions in the back of this chapter, pages 137, 38, and 39. You need to be aware of those. For your homework for this chapter, you're doing the chapter review exercises, odd 1 through 7, and then you're doing 9, 11, 13, and 21. So you'll answer either A or B for the true-false questions, and then you'll apply the code for the last 4 questions. In your workbook, you're going to be answering the odd glossary definitions and then the odd multiple choice questions. For the multiple choice questions, you are only going to record the letter that corresponds to the correct answer. You are not going to type out the correct answer. You're just going to put in the letter. Otherwise, your answer is going to be counted wrong. So let's go back to Chapter 7 in your textbook on page 120. And this is pulling out some of the coding guidelines to review those sections that are in Chapter 7. And it starts off with transplant versus administration. And one of the confusing things is when we think about a bone marrow transplant, we think it says bone marrow transplant. But in ICD-10, when we go to transplant for bone marrow, it tells us to see transfusion circulatory. And actually, a bone marrow transplant is in the section for administration. All the other transplants are actually in medical surgical, but not bone marrow. And I'm going to show you something that you can do here. If you're assigning a code and you're not necessarily sure of which body system or approach, but in this instance, I know my substance and I can click on G, then you'll see what happens. It narrows down the field. And typically, bone marrow transplants are done with the central vein, and they are percutaneous. They put in a catheter into the central vein, and that's a percutaneous approach. And then it depends on the qualifier, what you're going to assign. We'll say autologous. And so this would be my code for a bone marrow transplant, which is really not a transplant at all. Now, the one section I do want us to spend some time in is obstetrics, because if you're coding OBs, you'll spend a lot of time in obstetrics. You'll notice that there is only one body system for obstetrics, and it is pregnancy. And then as we move out of medical surgical and into these other sections, the root operations change. and become more limited. So you can see for operation, we have many fewer root operations. And in fact, abortion is a root operation that's only available in obstetrics. Delivery is only available in obstetrics. So there will be some root operations that are just specific to the section that you're coding in. Now, on the top of page 121, this is very important and it is confusing, and I apologize, but procedures performed on the products of conception are coded to the obstetrics section. If the procedure is performed on the pregnant female, other than the product of conception, they're coded to the appropriate root operation in medical surgical. And the example they have here is an amniocentesis. Even though they take a needle and they put it through the abdomen of the mother, the intent is to remove amniotic fluid, and that is a product of conception. Anything associated with that fetus, with that baby, is a product of conception. But an episiotomy or an episiotomy repair is not. That's performed on the mother. So let's type in amniocentesis. And so for an amniocentesis, what we're actually doing is we are removing fluid. So that meets the definition of the root operation of drainage. So we have drainage here as number 9. Let's click on this question mark and remind ourselves that drainage is taking out body fluid from a body part. And so when you do amniocentesis, you're taking amniotic fluid out of the amniotic sac. So this sends us to section 1090. And typically, the approach for these is percutaneous. There's no device. And if I'm doing amniotic fluid, it could be therapeutic or diagnostic. And usually it's diagnostic. They're taking that amniotic fluid out because they want to look at the fluid for abnormalities or anything like that. And you can see that this code is 10903ZU. Now I know O's are not used in PCS, so I'm not going to worry about putting a line through my O. But you see that Z? A lot of people make 2's that look like that. I do. There are times I have written a Z and then interpreted as a 2 when I was giving a lecture. So I put a line through my Z's, just right there in the middle, so that just like right there, I would draw a line so that I know that. I'm very careful when I write my U's so they don't look like a V. Because if you're a sloppy V writer, sometimes they look like a U, and of course you can read them because you're looking at, if you look at the word value, it doesn't matter if your V and your U look the same. One's a V and one's a U. Well, you won't know that in PCS until you become familiar with it. So be very careful with your U's and your V's. Now, if procedures are performed following a delivery or an abortion, and they're for curette of endometrium, the endometrial tissue, or evacuation of retained products of conception, those are all coded in the obstetrics section to the root operation of extraction, and then the body part is product of conception retained. So if I go to, let's just play around in this obstetrics section. So if I look at extraction, if I'm performing a C-section, then I am coding it to extraction, and it would be products of conception. And if I'm doing a C-section, it's usually open. They make an incision in the abdomen. There's no device. And then the qualifier actually tells us what type of incision. Was it a classical incision, a low cervical or an extraperitoneal incision, and usually it's low cervical. And so if my patient has a C-section, this is how I would code that. Let's look. Now, in the index, if I type in cesarean and put in cesarean, it tells me C extraction products of conception, but it will send me to this table, 10D0. And that's why using the index is so great if your procedure is in there. So I click, I come to this table. What I have to fill in is the approach and the qualifier, and then I have my code. Now, if my patient is having a D&C, and this is examples in your book, they're doing a D&C for retained products of conception, the code is actually going to come from this particular section. And when someone has retained products of conception, our body part becomes products of conception retained. And then typically it's via natural artificial opening. Usually it's not endoscopic, but it could be. You'll want to look very carefully at the documentation. And you'll see when you choose that, it's no device and no qualifier. If I take off the products of conception retained, then you can see that I have all of these other qualifiers available, but as soon as I do retained, then it's no qualifier. Now, the other thing that I want to show you that is, if it's a normal vaginal delivery, and I'm going to choose obstetrics, pregnancy, and delivery. And there's a very specific definition for what a delivery is. And if I go to delivery in the index, you can see that it does have many things listed here for us. But if it's a manually assisted delivery, then it's 10E0XZZ. Now, if a patient has anything other than a manually assisted delivery, we have to use a different code. We have to use the code, for instance, if forceps are used, we are back at extraction. And we're at products of conception. We can say via natural or artificial opening, and then we can choose whether the forceps were low, mid, or high. If a vacuum extractor was used, we can choose that. Or if, for instance, they rotated that baby, we can choose that. So manually assisted delivery is a very specific code. Basically, the doctor just catches the baby. But if he has to do anything else, any kind of manipulation, then we are at extraction. Now, if I'm going to do now, if I'm doing a D&C and a dilatation and curettage, and it is not obstetric, then I go to extraction endometrium, because that's what they're doing. It's the endometrium of the uterus. And typically that is via natural or artificial opening. It can be diagnostic, but it may not be diagnostic. If it's for menorrhagia, typically it is not diagnostic. But if the physician tells you it's diagnostic, then you code it like that. But this is just a regular D&C. Then our book tells us that there are certain new technology. In section X, we have new technology codes. And again, as a new coder, I wouldn't expect you to be using those codes, but we've looked through those. So certainly take some time to look through those. So for your question for this lecture, exercise 7.1 on page 123. I want you to answer question number 1 and question number 3. So page 123, exercise 7-1, questions 1 and 3 for this first lecture.